Hello, everyone. Welcome again to GBN Originals. My guest today is US based journalist Michael Shellenberger. Lovely to see you again, Michael. Thanks for making time.
Great to be with you, Neil.
To get right into it, I think it's fair to say that many of us in the UK are very alarmed about the erosion of freedom, including and very specifically the apparent erosion of freedom of speech. Um, I'm a Scottish person, and our national poet Robert Burns said words to the effect of that he wished that some power would give us the gift to see ourselves as others see us. And with that in mind, what can you tell us about how the US, I know you can't and don't speak for all Americans, but what is the view, would you say, of what's happening in the UK from your side of the Atlantic Ocean?
Just completely shocked. I mean, we Americans, we all have a funny relationship with Britain and with Europe, but it's a special relationship with Britain. We obviously look up in a lot of ways to Britain. I mean, we look up to the ways that our British brothers and sisters use the language. We think that you're the masters of this language, the creators of this language. We think of Milton, John Stuart Mill, George Orwell as the people that really pioneered the idea of free speech. And then, of course, in the case of Orwell, warned that there would be an attack upon it and that attack would come from the bureaucracies of government. People don't realize it about George Orwell because he was a socialist, but his idea of 1984 actually came from an American, a former communist named James Burnham, who wrote a book called The Managerial State, in which he said that totalitarianism would emerge out of the government bureaucracies. And that was always a theory until around 2016. And then we saw in 2016 with Brexit, the election of Trump, the emergence of a censorship industrial complex, the germs of which were already present, but it was created by the intelligence community, and it was really I'm talking about the CIA, the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security. We see in Britain right now that your prime minister has created a special police task force, 30 people arrested per day on speech crimes. Lucy Connolly, a mother, including of a vulnerable child, in prison for longer than child rapists and terrorists for sharing an inappropriate post on X, but that she deleted less than 4 hours later. And so we just look with bafflement and horror at what's occurring in Britain. But of course, we went through something very similar ourselves. I mean, in many ways, I think the American government is more responsible for the creation of the censorship industrial complex globally than anybody else. And, I mean, we see what's so shocking, about what's happening is that it's not just Britain. It's happening in Germany. It's happening in France. It's happening. Brussels is trying to impose a censorship regime globally through the Digital Services Act. And yesterday, the former president of Brazil was arrested, in part in response to a investigative expose we published showing that the Brazilian Supreme Court and Special Electoral Court had created essentially a star chamber to secretly use social media posts of nonviolent protesters who had protested at the Capitol on January 8th, 2023, and use that to incarcerate people. It basically in a process without, any process whatsoever. There was no defense attorneys, there was no juries. So there is a global crackdown on nationalist, populist political parties, candidates, and ideas. And it's coming from these deep state intelligence agencies. This is no longer a theory. This is conspiracy facts. This is a clear pattern. And unfortunately, we had hoped that the election of Donald Trump would basically put the kibosh on the censorship industrial complex worldwide. Instead, I think what we're seeing in Britain with Keir Starmer, in France with Emmanuel Macron, in Germany, in Brazil and other countries, Mexico, Canada. I mean, we could go on and on. We see a cracking down, a further cracking down in terms of censorship. We think, in large measure, in response to the election of Trump, they're trying to impose a global censorship system straight out of 1984, straight out of Black Mirror, on everybody in the world. And so that the final domino that would fall for them in their vision is the United States. And once the United States is gone, then I think all is lost. I truly do. Then we're in a completely digital prison worldwide.
Do you think what you're saying, that it's not just a Eurocentric, Western-centric paranoia that we are closer in many ways to the event horizon of the black hole of civilizational collapse here? Things are moving faster here, so that's not an optical illusion based on just being here and looking out at the world from here. But is it just because, or is it because it's the European world, it's ancient Greece, from which we get the concept of democracy? Is it for precisely those reasons that this is the font of that kind of freedom, and the literature and the architecture and the pursuit of freedom and the pursuit of beauty, has in so many ways, not exclusively, but it's very much been part of the European story? Do you think that's why this part of the world is in the crosshairs for this kind of totalitarian attention?
I think that's absolutely right. That's a very astute observation. And I appreciate you also pointing out in the ways in which it's a war on beauty, a war on humanity, a war on biology, a war on the fundamentals of what it means to be a human being, what it means to be a human being in the West, to enjoy freedom. It's, as you and all your readers know, Neil, it's just such a brief period that we've enjoyed, freedom, democracy, the freedom to choose our own leaders. And I find myself getting a little emotional thinking about it. I mean, people fought and died for these rights. And I think very few people, a very small number of people around the world, including you, and a small number of people, realize how close we are in terms of losing all of it. I think that the other major actor here, of course, is the United States. We are the global hegemon. We're the hegemon for the West. After World War II, I think quite understandably, there was an ideology of the open society. The idea from Karl Popper, made famous by George Soros. He named his foundations off after it. Everybody was very worried. We didn't want to have another war in Europe. We had fought 2 wars. Americans did not want to go to war in Europe. Obviously, Europeans suffered disproportionately, but it's not in our nature to want to be a global hegemon. To be an empire is not part of the American creed. It's a really alien idea. We like having big oceans that separate us from the world. The culture, the American culture was created by people that were trying to escape the oppression of closed societies in Europe. And so that ideology made sense, from after the 40s and the 50s to 60s. It starts to fall apart in the 90s. The open society idea was extended to China. And look at where we are now. China is now the model for population control, for information control, and I have to say, for mind control. And I'm not even talking about the mind control that the CIA experimented on in the 1960s with drugs and hypnosis. I'm talking about mind control through the media. And what happened was that with Brexit and Trump, the CIA and the intelligence community and all of its branches in the Western world realized that social media was a disruptive force, podcasts, disruptive force. Citizens would be able to communicate with each other in the way that you and I are communicating with each other right now. And the people who had controlled the discourse, controlled the conversation since 1945, and had maintained this open society ideology, they panicked. It was an elite panic, and they had to put it down. And so they invented this phony Russiagate collusion hoax to essentially entrap Trump and his aides. We've had documents now coming out in the United States over the last several weeks that show that this was an illegal secret conspiracy that's now proven. It's in all the documents that they invented this idea specifically to undermine the legitimacy of President Trump and undermine the legitimacy of populist nationalists, because, of course, the threat of populists and nationalists is that they're populists and nationalists. They're small d Democrats who represent the will of the people. And if you're the deep state that is trying to control all of society through the media, that's a huge threat. And so you want to paint the populists and nationalists as their opposite, as controlled by foreign powers. And so the law of projection prevails here. You see every single thing that they've accused populists and nationalists of, they're guilty of. The ultimate goal is just exactly what you've been describing for the last several years, Neil, so eloquently, which is it's a single global totalitarian system. They want digital IDs. Tony Blair, the president of Spain, our think tanks are making a huge push for digital IDs. They want to link your bank account to your social media. They want to be able to fine you for things that you say online. They want to be able to chill speech. They want to terrorize the population. They want the population afraid. They want the population afraid of affirming that there are men and women, and that only men and women can create life. This is deeply sinister. I mean, if you had sort of pitched it as a story, it would seem too crazy. It would seem like a Black Mirror episode, but it's unfolding at this moment around the Western world. And the intention is absolutely for it to finally happen in the United States. I mean, this is Bill Gates, Kamala Harris, Tim Walz, Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama. They were all promoting the very totalitarian censorship industrial complex that we see now being put in place quite dramatically in Britain and Europe and in Brazil. They want that in the United States, and if we allow it to get in place in other countries, I think it's going to be hard for us to resist. We have a First Amendment, but the social media companies, they call it the Brussels effect, because the social media companies, we fear, will ultimately be like, look, the whole world's under the system. We'll just go ahead and put the United States under that system too.
You mentioned the freedoms that were asserted and for which people bled and died in World War II and before, and the intention that followed the Second World War to pioneer and to champion and to protect and defend these freedoms. But I wonder, in the light of what you've just said, if that freedom wasn't to some extent illusory, that it was precisely because the authorities had control of the narrative via the mainstream media, which was the only media, that they were content they were secure in the knowledge that what appeared to be freedom was really being monitored and policed by them. They were in control of it. And it's precisely because of the advent of the internet and thereafter social media, the advent of truly democratized communication between the proles, between the people, unmoderated, not mediated by the authorities, that was when they had to clamp down, because what had appeared to be freedom and democracy was really just an optical illusion. And what they saw happening with the advent of the internet was real democracy, and that
Yep.
suddenly the gloves had to come off.
Yeah, Neil, spot on. When you read the major histories of the idea of freedom of speech, going back to Socrates, one of the most famous victims of censorship, had to die for his right to speak freely. And you read that history, you do get to this moment of 1776 in the United States. And we sometimes think, well, I think, are we just being, nationalist in imagining 1776 was an important year? It was a major year because, of course, you had the printing press emerge, hundreds of years earlier, but it had been a fight, to be able to print pamphlets. And, the Catholic Church at first liked it, but then the Protestants got a hold of it and they were chasing printing presses all around Europe. You get to the United States and the printing presses were allowed to print, and the founders of the United States said that they didn't want a country if they couldn't have absolute freedom of speech. where in Europe and other countries, the kings would gradually give you more and more free speech rights. In the United States, the founders of the United States said, we don't want a country if we don't have free speech. So free speech comes before the government. It's an inalienable right given to us by our creator. It's not given to us by the king. It's given to us by nature or by God or by our creator. Whatever you believe, it's you get that upon birth, the right to speak freely. And then you create a government based on that freedom of speech. And that was the ethos. And, it was pretty strong. There's certainly been some periods in the United States, particularly in the early 20th century, when it was the left that was being persecuted by the FBI, and socialists and communists were being arrested. And it had been the left that had fought to protect freedom of speech. And we have a very high standard in the United States. The court has repeatedly ruled that people are allowed to lie in politics. What else do they do when they run for election? The court had ruled that you can say horrible things. You can actually call for genocide. You can call for people's deaths. You can't immediately incite violence. The line that the U.S. Supreme Court drew was around the immediate incitement of violence. And that was the standard, until very recently. And it was obviously a little bit different history in Europe. But I think, Neil, to your point, there was a period really in World War I think, was the period where the leaders of the United States said, we have to get the public mobilized to go to war, because the public didn't want to go to war during World War I. So they created these elaborate propaganda ministries. They had Hollywood involved. There was a gentleman named Walter Lippmann, who's a famous social scientist, who invented the phrase manufacturing of consent, which anybody who is on the left or was on the left knows is the name of a famous book by Noam Chomsky, also a leftist, who would describe that was the way. And they were using psychology. They were using the ideas of Freud, including projection, but the manipulation of desires. The U.S. government was using that, and they used that during World War I. They used it during World War II. World War II, obviously, we had Pearl Harbor that motivated us to go to war finally. But after World War II, and there's an amazing documentaries, about this by Curtis, on the Century of the Self, where he describes how the elites would use psychology to manipulate people. But all of that depended on the state having a heavy control over the television networks, over the newspapers. We know for a fact the CIA had people on the payroll of the New York Times and other newspapers, hundreds of people around the world. And then there was these think tanks, Aspen Institute, that are government-funded think tanks, that are an Atlantic Council, that are manipulating public opinion. And yeah, then with the internet, you kind of would a chance to kind of go back to that original printing press, where you can have peer-to-peer communication, which the New York Times and others have demonized. How dare we let there be peer-to-peer, people-to-people communication? Don't they know we have to have special committees decide what people are allowed to say? And that's what's being created right there in Britain. I mean, that's what Prime Minister two-tier Keir Starmer has created, is special committees of people that will decide what the Brits are allowed to read and say and hear online. And then they're doing the exact same thing in Brussels with the Digital Services Act. It's a revolt of the elites against a revolt of the public that was enabled by this technological revolution of the internet and social media.
It's increasingly amazing to me the way in which we've long been invited to consider media as quite frivolous, just a kind of just for fun in many ways, because it's becoming increasingly apparent just how central and fundamental and powerful it really is. I mean, you mentioned Freud, and of course his nephew Bernays, was the father of propaganda and public relations, and the way in which the lionizing of Marshall McLuhan, in his interpretation of the centrality of media, the medium is the message. But he made no bones about the fact of how powerful, how all-pervasive, and what a tool media are. And I think because the internet was, it was certainly as close as we've ever been to something decentralized and peer-to-peer.
Yep.
And I think the advent of the internet, whether it was by accident or by design, the efforts of DARPA and MIT and the rest of it in the 1960s, what they gave birth to was such a double edged sword.
Hmm.
And I think so much of what we're seeing now in terms of the clampdown is the realization too late, I would say, too late in the day, that if you what they created for themselves inadvertently gifted to us for the first time the ability to have peer-to-peer communication. And my goodness, what a price we're being made to pay.
Mm. Yeah, you're spot on, Neil. I mean, it's look, the intelligence community made good use of social media. We know the CIA was heavily involved in the Arab Spring revolutions in the Middle East, um, and then also with the color revolutions in Europe. To some extent, they were innovative because they were using social media as a tool for mobilizing the public, also for running information operations. I mean, there's basically was a whole cottage industry of think tanks and of journalism, so-called journalism organizations that would get information leaked to them from the intelligence community about the finances of politicians that the United States didn't like. And then they would do supposedly independent investigative journalism showing that those politicians were puppets of Putin or were corrupt or something. They would use the social media to shape public opinion and then to mobilize people into the streets, at which point the US government or other actors would urge the heads of state to step down. That regime change playbook has basically been around since the United States CIA changed the outcome of the 1948 election in Italy, when we were worried that the communists would take over, and the CIA got involved and bribed people and manipulated the media. And so really, and this is the US empire was always different than previous empires in that it was really, I mean, to do a global empire, you can have a lot of military around the world, and we certainly do, but it's really depends on consent, because as Max Weber teaches us, the state is the body that has the legitimate monopoly on violence. Sometimes people misunderstand that and think it's just the monopoly on violence. It has to be legitimate. So legitimacy of the state is everything. And so when, if Keir Starmer loses enough legitimacy, then there can be a vote of no confidence. Let's hope for that moment at some point. If a politician loses legitimacy, they have to step down. Legitimacy is the currency of the realm in our modern era with a media culture, instantaneous media culture. The other thing I'll say, Neil, is that, when you look at the censorship industrial complex, the people in it, you kind of go from World War II until today. They, in their own writings, they got very clear that really people think in stories, and that language is essential. So it's the media, but it's also who can use it well. And the thing that gives me hope is that that it's up to us, and you're a master of language. And I think being able to tell the story, telling a truthful story, but that the elites understand that it's all about narrative. And so it's not just like messages or memes. Really, it's about the stories that we tell. And the other thing that's going, and so we need to tell a powerful story. We need to tell a story that reminds people that, look, our ancestors died and were tortured in order to defend our right to have free speech and our right to govern ourselves. And we do not want to be the generation that lost that after hundreds of years, thousands of years. Can you imagine? I mean, imagine us losing free speech and democracy on our watch. What a shame that would be on us, and our descendants would look at us with scorn, as they should. That we had failed to defend the thing that all of our ancestors had defended for hundreds of years. I think the other thing that's going for us, Neil, is just that. Well, there's a couple other things I want to say. Is that we also have the Streisand effect on our side. So every time they censor something, we need to find a way to get the word out, because everybody, we're wired through evolution to pay attention to the thing that the tyrants are trying to prevent us from learning about. So we should draw attention. It's known as the Streisand effect, because Barbara Streisand got millions of people to look at pictures of her home after she tried to censor them. So we've got that on our side. And then I think the final thing that we have, that's going for us now, there people in government that are starting to leak documents, that are turning whistleblower. If they're, I always say, we need you to come forward. I have promised to go to prison to defend all of our sources. The good news is that we are now getting more and more people in government, people in every branch of government that are leaking information, providing information. Often they can do so in ways that it won't be traced back to them, but we need those leaks. We need people in the Starmer government to expose, to leak documents to you at GBNews, to me at public.news, because we really do depend on seeing what's behind the curtain. We because it is a star chamber, it's secret, and we need to be able to shine light on it in order to save our democracy and save our freedoms.
Just as you said, just before you said behind the curtain, I was thinking that so often is invoked at the moment the idea of the Wizard of Oz. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. That counter to everything that they've been attempting to do in the most recent past, the censorship military complex, they have absolutely exposed the small reality of themselves. They have revealed themselves to be small, to be without ideas, far less beauty, and the big people and the big ideas are out here, where we are. We've both mentioned the idea of beauty. We've been thrown back into conversations again about the US Constitution, 1776, inalienable rights. We've been thrown back on the fundamentals, which is probably very timely. And it seems to me that what we're seeing, this placing of metaphorical hands over metaphorical mouths, is the revelation of the fact that the official narrative has utterly collapsed.
Mm-hmm.
They have no argument, they have no meta-narrative, they have no big story to tell. And so all they can do is seek, in a childish way, to try and stop the good story coming out of the mouths of good people. And I feel that we should take great comfort and confidence in the fact that all they have is censorship, because they have nothing worth saying.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, it is so beautiful, Western civilization, and if you've traveled around the world, you know, there's just nothing like the West, and there's so many beautiful cultures in the world. I've been all over the world. I love so many of them, but they don't have freedom. They don't have democracy. They don't have good governance. You can't have good governance without free speech. So this emergent idea of self-governance through freedom of speech, freedom of movement, freedom of religion, I mean, it's the greatest idea that our species has come up with that we know of. And so we've got to fight to protect it. And I think your point is so spot on. A large person, a confident person, can withstand people saying awful things about them, and with a smile even. People that will, if you're an elected official and people are saying just the worst things about you, it's a large person that can say, I'm so glad that that person can express their views and that everybody can hear their views, and that we're able to have a debate around the substance, and that we're free to respond to things that we don't think are true or accurate. That's a large person. It's an evolved consciousness. Neil, what's so interesting when you see, I had forgotten about how as a boy, when I first learned that the Supreme Court of the United States allowed Nazis to march through neighborhoods of Holocaust survivors in the 1960s and 70s. I was shocked and appalled by this. My father explained it to me. I still remember thinking how wrong it was that the Supreme Court allowed this group of people to do something so horrible as to defend Nazism in front of people that had suffered the highest cost of it. And my father had to explain it to me. I think it probably took several years for me to understand it. Our first you watch little kids play, and they're always yelling at each other to shut up, shut up. It's a very base, childish emotion. And yet here we see it, like, from our elected leaders. Keir Starmer says, oh, nobody can call me names. Nobody can call me two-tier Keir. He's too sensitive. He's too small. The German politicians are demanding that people that insult them be arrested. I mean, that's what they're finding and arresting people that hold up signs. There's one of them. The guy held up it did a meme of the former Interior Secretary holding up a sign saying that she favored censorship. It was just a joke, and they prosecuted him. So I mean, we're our leaders, and this is a sad reflection on where our cultures are at. But our leaders are children. They're mental children. They have not evolved to the stage that our ancestors had reached by the 18th century. You know, in the Enlightenment, they had reached in the 18th century that really, as mature, evolved human beings, we can tolerate people saying nasty things about us, and we don't need to send them to prison. We don't need to have them tortured. In fact, I mean, when you look back at the crazy things, the American founding fathers, they would write anonymous pamphlets lying about each other, and it was tolerated because there was a sense in which, well, let people, answer themselves, but we don't want to go down the road of letting the king decide what people can say. So I think you're absolutely right, Neil. I hope that this is an existential moment for the West, that we see just how, I mean, it is grave. Like, we are on the cusp of global digital totalitarian prison. Like, that is where we are at. I had hoped that the Trump election would put an end to that and restore commitment to freedom and democracy, but everything has gone in the wrong direction, and it's accelerated in the wrong direction since his election, nowhere more dramatically than Britain. So, look, I just want to say that, we're here to fight alongside our British brothers and sisters. We host a free speech meeting in London now every June. We are eager to, whistleblowers in government, feel free to leak us documents. We are an American publication. We can't be censored by your government. And Neil, we'll be there to fight it out, with the censors and the totalitarians and the people that want to create a Chinese Black Mirror style digital identification system. We will fight till the bitter end alongside you. And we fought before together 80 years ago, and we're ready to go back at it to defend our freedoms, because, we need each other. We those of us that love freedom and love beauty, I think we really need each other more than ever right now.
Yeah, you invoke, just before I let you go, just the thought. Another thought you've inspired is, you mentioned that prophets like Orwell and others said that the real trouble would come from the bureaucrats and from administration in that sense. And it makes me think of Hannah Arendt's immortal line about the banality of evil. That evil is banal when it, in many ways, when it manifests itself, and that's what we are seeing. I think I like to think that we're coming to the apogee of a time when it's just banality, loss of ideas at the top, a complete disregard of beauty at the top, disregard, even complete ignorance of the fundamentals of beauty, of what it has been to be human and alive. We're seeing it, and it's ugly and it's unpleasant to watch. But I think it has within it, whether they mean it to or not, the seeds of something better. And that people like yourself, very much people like you, are going to be why we will win.
Well, amen to that. I hope so, because I think that people had forgotten how special our civilization is. It took really a war on the civilization. I mean, Europe is in a process of basically committing civilizational suicide right now. And I think it's that should remind us of just how precious and special freedom and democracy are, and why we need to fight for them and be willing to die for them. If we're not willing to die for them, then we don't deserve them. And I think that, like I said, I think it would just be a real shame on everybody who's alive today, everybody who's an adult and conscious, if we were to lose this very special freedoms that people had fought so hard and died in order to protect.
As always, Michael Shellenberger, it's been a real pleasure to listen to your insight. I always take confidence and reassurance from what you have to say. So again, and not for the last time, I'll say thank you very much for being so generous with your time. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you, Neil. Thanks for having me on.